Good afternoon. As we wait for people to connect, I want to thank you all for joining us for a discussion that could not be more timely. I'm Ann Lewis, and I'm Chair Emerita of the Democratic Majority for Israel. This weekend, as we all saw, talks between the United States and Israel, led by Vice President J.D. Vance and Speaker of the Iran's parliament, ended without an agreement. Meanwhile, since then, President Trump has announced a U.S. blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, which came into effect yesterday, and in response to Hezbollah's constant bombardment of Israel has continued its offensive to dislodge Hezbollah from southern Lebanon ahead of today's talks in Washington between the Lebanese and Israeli ambassadors to the United States. Those talks are now going forward with Secretary of State Marco Rubio. So, as we meet, path to forward in the Middle East remains deeply uncertain. We have a lot to talk about. Now, before we get started, a reminder, please consider following us on social media. We're on X, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky. Sign up for our news and updates at our website, dmfi.org. Today, if you want to ask a question, submit it through the Q&A feature on your Zoom interface. And if you're watching on Facebook, you can enter in the comment section. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers. Danny Citrinowicz is a senior researcher in the Iran and the Shi'ite Axis Program at the Institute for National Security Studies. Danny served 25 years in a variety of command positions in the Israeli Defense Intelligence, including as head of the Iran branch in the Research and Analysis Division and as the division's representative in the United States. I'm also delighted to welcome back to DMFI Jacob Magid, the U.S. Bureau Chief for the Times of Israel, who oversees the paper's coverage of American politics, Jewish community affairs, and U.S.-Israel relations. Jacob earlier served as the newspaper's settlements correspondent, reporting intensively on West Bank developments and regional politics. A Chicago native, Jacob earned a Bachelor of Arts in Arabic Studies and Political Science from the University of Maryland. Danny, why don't you start us off?
Again, and thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate that. And again, thank you for putting me with Jacob, that I have a lot of appreciation for him. I was fortunate enough to give him some interviews, and definitely is one of my favorite journalists, goes without saying. So thank you for that. I will start by saying again, just in a nutshell, where we stand right now regarding Iran. So allowing Jacob to speak about Lebanon and just discussing, allowing a Q&A. I think that just to do a small recap of how we got here, is the fact that at the end of the day, Israel and the US combined operation that actually meant to undermine the regime in Iran and actually significantly damage its missile capacity and the enrichment capabilities, or its ability to reach a nuclear bomb. Now, the good thing about this operation is the fact that operationally, definitely the cooperation between Central Command and IDF is really extraordinary in so many ways. I was fortunate enough to work with the CENTCOM Command, and definitely they are highly expertise, and I think they know Iran almost as good as the IDF. And I think this kind of cooperation is really significant in significantly damaging the Iranian air defense capabilities, and also the ability to manufacture missiles and hitting hard on the arsenal. Unfortunately, those operational achievements did not accumulate into strategic effect, meaning that this regime has not been toppled. There's no regime change. It was a change within the regime that actually transformed the Iranian regime to become more radical. In terms of the missiles, the Iranians are still launching missiles and drones. They still have the capacity to do so. And in terms of the enrichment, unfortunately, we couldn't get out the enriched material that the Iranians have, especially the 440 kilos for 60%, that enriched uranium that actually in Isfahan and in Natanz. Why it's so important? Because this radical regime, if he wants to rush into a bomb, you already have the fissile material to do that. To enrich between 60 and 90 is really a matter of days if you have the right equipment. And according to Wall Street Journal, they have the centrifuges. So this is a problem that we have. So the bottom line of things that we have operational achievements, but unfortunately, so no strategic gains that we actually put on the table at the beginning of the campaign. Now, after the campaign, after Israel and the US decapitated the senior leadership of Iran, especially Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, the Iranians retaliated, attacking Israel, the Gulf states, and of course taking over Hormuz Straits that actually were open before the war started. And now what they're trying to do is they're trying to, they know they're being absorbed a lot of pain, but they think that they can they can absorb a lot of pain to the international community, international economy. This is what they're trying to do, looking at the price of oil and things like that. So the campaign actually was stopped by President Trump a moment before he decided to attack the civilian infrastructure in Iran, thinking about the next level, because he wanted to capitulate on the achievements and start negotiation. And indeed, the negotiation started last weekend when J.D. Vance came to Islamabad and met with Iran delegation headed by Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf. He is the Speaker of the Majlis. And they discussed numerous things, but I think the two most important things that actually will set the tone for the negotiation itself are the nuclear issue and the question of the control of the Hormuz. There is a definitely lack of trust between both sides, and it's very hard to reach an agreement. After 21 hours, Vance left Islamabad and said that the Iranians need to decide what to do, and the US declared a naval blockade on Iran. Where we stand right now is I think that we're one step before maybe an agreement and one step before escalation. I'll explain. The Iranians want, the Iran and the US, I think they want to make sure they are trying to find a political solution. I don't see any appetite, not in Tehran and not in Washington, to turn back to war. And if we turn back to war, it's going to be very, very violent, because then the US will have to whether to invade Hag Island or to attack the civilian infrastructure in Iran. And things will become very violent from the beginning, from the outset of the renewal of the war. So I don't think there's a lot of appetite there. There are many gaps in the negotiation, especially because of the fact that the two sides start thinking that they won. The US see the operational achievement saying, okay, we won, we can dictate our conditions. But from the Iranian standpoint, they have the upper hand because they are controlling the artery of the international economy. They managed to attack Israel, especially the Gulf states. So for them, and they of course survive. And the winning is by not losing. So for them, they thought that nobody can dictate us nothing because we have major achievements. Now, I think this is what happened in Pakistan, but we know that there was advancement in Pakistan, especially regarding the nuclear issue. I think that this is a very important development because they're not talking about the right to enrich that Iran demanded, but the level of suspension, how long it will suspend, between 5 and 20 years. And I think that, I'm not saying they're close to an agreement, but I think that they're closer than they've been before the war, the negotiation started. So I'll just, for the final stretch of things, I'll say that. I think there's going to be another round of talks, crucial one, because if they'll find a solution for that, for some sort of structural agreement, then they're going to extend the ceasefire for a lengthy period of time. I don't think we'll see anyone returning back to war. But if the negotiation will collapse, or some way they're not going to meet in Islamabad, and they're not going to be an extension of the ultimatum of Trump on Monday, then escalation is almost inevitable, given the fact that the Iranians won't accept the fact that the US is blockading them. So they can attack the US presence over there, they can attack tankers that are trying to go for Hormuz Strait, they can attack the oil infrastructure of Saudi Arabia or Qatar or whatever. So I think in that regard, really, and again, we find ourselves in a pivotal moment when both sides are not eager to return back to war, but without some sort of a peaceful solution that are working hard, especially the mediation, the Pakistanis, the Turks, the Saudis, and the Egyptians, then it will be very hard to prevent another escalation. So again, we have to wait to see how things will develop here, but I'll stop allowing Jacob to speak about Lebanon.
Well, thank you so much. And now, Jacob, you're on.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. A real honor to be with Danny. I think he is the expert on Iran. So because of that, I'm just not even gonna try to dip my toes into that topic. I'm happy to maybe during the question and answer speak a little bit about what I'm hearing from sources, but I think you're better served with Danny on that one. Regarding Lebanon, so I've been covering this meeting that took place in Washington at the State Department just a couple hours ago, just wrapped up minutes before we went on. And I spoke with a Lebanese official, an Israeli official, and a US official to try to get different perspectives of how each side is looking at this pretty historic meeting. It's the first time we've seen officials at this level. There have been meetings in the past in the 90s, but I think this, you could argue, is the highest, most senior engagement between Israel and Lebanon happening at the ambassador level in Washington today, with the Israeli ambassador to the US and the Lebanese ambassador to the US. And then they were joined by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, several other US officials. I think Mike Needham was one of them, one of Rubio's close aides, as well as Mike Waltz happened to stop by, the US ambassador to the UN, and several others. So it was a pretty remarkable, even just the photo shoot before the meeting started. It wasn't really a handshake, as I was told by a US official they were hoping would happen. But you did have the two ambassadors from Israel and Lebanon standing right next to each other. And then Rubio giving some brief remarks to reporters about what they're hoping to achieve from these talks. From the Lebanese perspective, I think, speaking with this official who said that what the goal was at this meeting and just in general is to try to separate the Lebanon file from the Iranian file. And what he meant by that is that right now we're actually having a unique dynamic playing out where Iran is calling for a ceasefire in Lebanon. And you could argue that that would be the surest way for Lebanon to achieve that ceasefire, the quickest way, because the US seemed to be sympathetic to it. Even what I was told initially, that was the terms of the agreement before Netanyahu started pushing back, was that the ceasefire in Iran was also supposed to cover Lebanon. And that would have been something you would have assumed the Lebanese government, as much as they don't like Hezbollah, would want to see, because these attacks were getting pretty widespread all throughout the country. And therefore, you would assume maybe they would be okay with, even if it's Iran, let's try to get a ceasefire on the books and then move from there from trying to separate. But the argument the Lebanese official made was that if you do that, then you're making Lebanon even more beholden to Iran and giving Hezbollah a larger stake in the talks that are playing out. So the goal, therefore, has been for a long time is to try to hold these direct negotiations with Israel, to try to separate as much as possible the Lebanese and the Iranian track, and kind of neuter Hezbollah's ability to influence at such a high level. And basically, there has been offers for weeks, if not months. I was going actually back to a year now, where there's been calls from Joseph Aoun, the president of Lebanon, to hold direct talks with Israel that were largely ignored, feeling that more military gains needed to be made against Hezbollah, and they could be made in the battlefield, and less so in diplomatic negotiations. So there was. These calls were ignored, and then we saw basically an agreement from Israel to finally hold these talks. It happened last week, or the agreement came last week, and I can get into how that played out. But now the goal is to use these talks, as far as Lebanon is concerned, is to achieve that ceasefire and then frame it as a ceasefire that you've secured because of the strength of the Lebanese government, as opposed to the weakness of the Lebanese government that is simply getting what it wants because Iran is vouching for it. So that's the goal. I think that Beirut is the main goal, I would say, in these talks. And they were hoping that it would be a precondition for these talks. Even you heard Nawaf Salam, the Lebanese prime minister, talk about that was going to be what Lebanon was demanding even before sitting down with Israel. But I think there's a recognition they don't totally have all the cards, as Trump likes to say. And therefore, there was willingness to hold this meeting. Maybe that was one of the reasons it was only at the ambassadorial level. Maybe that was one of the reasons that it was no warm handshake. They still would like to see a ceasefire to demonstrate actual gains for this pretty unprecedented engagement with Israel. And they haven't gotten that yet. But there is also willingness, of course, to talk about disarming Hezbollah, which is something that I think Israel obviously wants to see, and also Hezbollah or the Lebanese government is willing to do. But the argument that they're trying to make to Israel is that this needs to be a slow process because, of course, we recognize that Hezbollah poses a threat. It's harming our own national stature. However, if we do this too quickly, we're risking sparking a civil war, is what this Lebanese official said. We're not trying to pull a fast one on Israel. We're not just trying to say things and then act differently. We genuinely do want to take these steps. We've tried to do that so far. But this needs to be done in a responsible and somewhat measured way. And this official pointed to what he said was a real sea change that had happened on March 2nd, which was the day that we saw Hezbollah start firing at Israel in response to Israel's killing of Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. That Hezbollah decided to enter the conflict and drag the entire country of Lebanon with it. And you saw a real, what he called a sea change, in that there was real anger across the board at Hezbollah. Spoke with another analyst who happened to be in Lebanon at the time and talked about seeing people in Beirut and in Shia dominant areas and were just cursing Hezbollah in the streets, not caring about who heard. This kind of real frustration that, yes, there was some rhetoric before, but this was really a shift. This is more so than Gaza, because I think that was 2 years ago. That was 2 years, and yes, there was frustration there. But the argument now is that this is a difference maker on March 2nd. However, there was another date that he circled, which was April 8th. And I think this is a date that sort of passed pretty quickly in Israel without a lot of thought. But in Lebanon, this was a day of massive airstrikes, the largest since the war started against Iran, very deep into Lebanese territory, into Sunni villages that aren't used to getting the brunt of these attacks. Usually they're focused more in the Dahia, the southern suburbs of Beirut. But this was much further. I mean, the death toll was over around 350 people. Israel says about 250 of those fighters, of those 350 were Hezbollah fighters. But there was also, I think the Lebanese health ministry talks about 1/3 of the death toll being women and children. And there were quite a few clips of footage to corroborate that. And this was a moment that the officials said that Israel's risking overplaying its hand. That if you take this hard of an approach against all of Lebanon, you're going to risk losing the goodwill that was gained on March 2nd. So that's what he talked about in the lead up to this meeting. Turning to the Israeli official, the argument that he said is that, look, we've heard this talk about a sea change in Lebanon before, that now we're going to start taking on Hezbollah, that we're unwilling to accept the way that it's taking control of the country and dragged it into war after war. That was what we heard after Gaza. And that was what we saw, or that was what we heard when the Lebanese army announced that Hezbollah had been disarmed up to the Litani River, so deep into the country. And then we found out in the past few weeks that was complete BS, that Hezbollah is very armed. And if it wasn't armed before, it's managed to rearm in the meantime and pose a significant threat to Israel, hitting not just northern Israel, but also all the way to even Tel Aviv and central Israel has been under Hezbollah missile fire. So I think there's a lot of trust right now in what the Lebanese government is saying. And there's even some concern. I spoke with an Israeli official who said that they are trying to lull us to sleep, that this is not that they genuinely believe or are interested in disarming Hezbollah, but they know that this is what they need to say to get the approval of the US. And therefore that's the strategy they're taking when they're not actually looking to take on Hezbollah with the necessary steps. And that was why I think this Israeli official did not have a lot of optimism about this meeting today. He said that don't expect the peace doves to start flying out at the end of it, which is, I guess, not what we saw in the end. And really, so basically, he hinted that the only reason that they're there is that there was pressure from the Trump administration. Because if you recall, there were these offers from the Lebanese government for a while to hold these talks, and they were largely ignored by the Netanyahu government. And what we saw after the announcement of a ceasefire, while the U.S. was okay with Israel separating Lebanon and continuing striking there, I think it was really caught off guard by the scope of those attacks on April 8th, the day after that ceasefire on April 7th in Iran. And you had concerning calls from U.S. officials, including from President Trump to Prime Minister Netanyahu, urging him to roll, kind of, I guess he called it low-keying it in Lebanon. And I think there was an even understanding from the Israeli perspective that if Israel did not announce its willingness to enter these talks, and if Israel did not start rolling back some of its strikes against Hezbollah, maybe not going into Beirut, which it hasn't done since last Wednesday, that Israel could actually find itself with President Trump announcing unilaterally that a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah had been reached. And that was why one of the reasons this Israeli official hinted at that Israel finally agreed to hold these talks in Washington. But in the meantime, the Israeli official said that there's still the thought process in Jerusalem is to move towards this creation of a reestablishment of a buffer zone, something we had seen taken down in the early 2000s, recognizing that it wasn't something that was effective at the time and actually curbing Hezbollah, and that was causing a lot of damage to Israeli troops. However, the feeling right now is that we'd rather have put our soldiers in harm's way than our civilians. We need to be able to secure the northern border. These communities who have been under immense fire for years need to be able to have security. And the buffer zone right now is the belief that will be the more effective route. And the idea of Israel further withdrawing from Lebanon right now just doesn't seem very likely during an election year for Prime Minister Netanyahu, where he's more likely to come under criticism from the right-wing coalition partners that are likely to make his next coalition, which just makes it harder to campaign on. However, the U.S. officials said that they are committed to this process. And I think the hint to that was Marco Rubio's presence at this meeting today. It wasn't supposed to be with him there. I think it was supposed to be with Mike Needham, one of his top aides, and Michelle Issa, the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon. But I think by having Rubio there, it demonstrates the seriousness with which the U.S. is taking this, and maybe indicates that it's willing to prioritize this issue once again. Because as opposed to the Gaza front or even Syria, where you had a lot of very high-level engagement and interest in the U.S. of having some sort of agreement on both those fronts, Lebanon was kind of deprioritized. There wasn't a lot of hope. I think you saw from U.S. officials that there could be a major breakthrough here. There was much more focus with Israel-Syria talks than Israel-Lebanon. But I think maybe because there was an assumption that the status quo before, where Israel could just continue striking every day and not face any blowback from Hezbollah, was sustainable. But now I think with the way that the Iran ceasefire is going, if there's concern that ceasefire could be put at harm's way by continued firing in Lebanon, you will likely see more U.S. pressure on Israel to maybe not agree to a normalization deal tomorrow, absent any major Hezbollah disarmament. But I do think this is going to be a higher priority, and Rubio's presence demonstrates that.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Danny. You've both given us a lot of information. I'm now going to turn it over to Rachel Bombach, our Chief Policy Officer, and she's going to lead us in what I know will be a lot of questions. So for a Q&A session, take it away, Rachel.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you both, Danny and Jacob, for your very insightful opening remarks. I'm Rachel Bombach, Chief Policy Officer at DMFI, and I am delighted to moderate the Q&A portion of this program. Just a reminder that if you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A box on Zoom, or if you're watching on social media, type it into the comments section. First, on the war with Iran, Danny, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said that Israel crushed Iran's nuclear program, ballistic missile program, and regime leadership. So how should we understand those purported achievements compared to your description at the top of the program that there really weren't many, if any, strategic achievements from this war?
I will say that. Definitely there were achievements, but what Prime Minister Netanyahu presenting is actually exaggeration to justify the war. The war, as we turn to the war aims that we had, we have to remember that, yes, we degraded the Iranian missile capabilities, goes without saying, but eventually this wasn't the purpose of this war. The purpose of this war, first and foremost, was to create the conditions to change the regime, and the regime did not change. Actually, there was a change, as I mentioned, within the regime itself, much worse than we encountered before the war started. Second, regarding the nuclear, what he said is actually not correlates with the truth, and I have to emphasize that. There was no attacks, no in Fordo, almost no in Natanz, no in Isfahan during the war itself, because the problem is that we have 440 kills for 60% buried in Isfahan, Natanz, in a way that it would be very hard to take it out. It's not a command operation, something larger than that, and maybe theoretically it's possible. Practically, it's very hard to do so. And Prime Minister Netanyahu knows that. So in order to justify the war itself, he changed the purpose of the war. Now discussing him and Defense Minister Katz, talk about the fact that taking out the enriched material from Iran would be an achievement, although definitely it was an achievement. And by the way, the Iranians are willing to dilute the material even before the war. So I think what Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to do, he's trying to do two things. First, he hoped that the war did not end. He's trying to pressure President Trump to leave the political route and return back to war and hitting hard on the Iranian infrastructure. He believes that will prevent Iran from being a strategic threat to the state of Israel. And for him, it's important to continue the war. But I have to say one thing: if the war will end as it is, especially if there will be an agreement between Iran and the US on the nuclear file that looks more or less like JCPOA++, it's better than JCPOA, but on the same characteristics, then we should ask ourselves what actually we achieved in the war strategically and not operationally. So the bottom line of things, I think that his presentation of the achievements of the war are disconnect from reality. Yes, again, I'm not underestimating the achievement that we have, but they are not the achievements or the purpose of the war that we looked when we actually decided to go to the war with the US administration.
Thank you. Dan, for you, Danny or Jacob, if you want to weigh in, do you see this ceasefire holding, or are we going to see a return to active conflict soon? And what are we to make of the buildup of U.S. ground forces in the region? Do you think that was a negotiating tactic, or do you expect that they could still be used operationally?
Jacob, you want to take it, or?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll chime in if there's anything, but I think you got it.
Okay, so yeah, so I'll say that, as I mentioned, I think both sides are interested in an agreement. I think there is little appetite returning back to the war, but I think that both sides are preparing for return back to the war because, as we know, negotiations, there are lack of distrust, and as I mentioned, there's still gaps in the negotiation with the Hormuz and enrichment or nuclear issue. Also, as I mentioned, I think that they are making grounds, or at least on nuclear, but still we don't know whether they're going to be in agreement. So if they're not going to be in agreement, then both sides are getting ready. I think President Trump wants to have the ability to have some sort of a land invasion. Again, we're not talking about conquering Iran. We're talking about whether to take Hog Island, take the islands in the entrance of the Gulf, or maybe try to take out the enriched uranium from Natanz and Isfahan. So, and he's getting ready for that, and this is why the carrier Bush is also on its long way towards the Gulf. So I think both sides, and it's not, we shouldn't make any mistake by thinking that also the Iranians are getting ready for a renewed war, and I think they're working hard to take out the missiles and launchers that are being stuck in what we call the missile cities. What we had is US and Israel actually blocking the entrance of those cities, and then they're working hard to open it and just use that if the war will escalate. So both sides are working the dual track here, trying to reach an agreement by preparing for an escalation if actually they're not going to succeed. I think that for now, and again, everything is possible, but I think the next round of discussion will be extremely important. Because of the fact that if there's going to be some sort of gradual compromise from both sides, then I think at least they will postpone the ultimatum. So we're getting close to a decision point. And again, the question is whether the will of both sides to reach an agreement will overcome the mistrust and especially the gaps that are already there, and especially the lack of or the gap in expectation. As I mentioned, each side thinking one. So I think there is a possibility for an agreement. But the thing is that there are lots of barriers, and if this will collapse immediately or immediately after, I think we'll see escalation, and both sides want to be ready for that, including the possibility of using soldiers. Again, President Trump using that like the leverage that he has in the maritime blockade to pressure Iran. Not that it's going to help, but he believes in that. And if not, then he can able to use that. Again, I don't think it will be his first choice, but it's another option in his toolkit once, if and when the negotiation will collapse.
Thank you. We have a question from Hannah. The IDF has been under tremendous pressure, basically been at war since October 7th. So for how much longer can the IDF continue to operate effectively, given the stresses, especially on reservist forces?
I'll just speak briefly and let Danny chime in. I think there was a cabinet meeting that was held last week or 2 weeks ago where the cabinet approved another several dozen legalizations of outposts in the West Bank. And basically the response from the IDF's chief of staff was to raise an alarm for the ministers, basically saying you're stretching us so thin in the West Bank, in addition to what's happening in Lebanon, in addition to what's happening in Gaza, in addition to what's happening in Iran, this is not sustainable. And that's why I think there's extra pressure. And right now we're hearing about the passage of a legislation that is supposed to help regulate this issue of ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students serving in the military. However, what most military experts are saying is that that's not enough. What the government is trying to put forward is actually just aimed at giving blanket exemptions and not actually ensuring that enough soldiers are being drafted. So it is stretched thin, but these are different fronts. And Danny can speak more authoritatively than I can, that we're not talking about ground troops in Iran. It's more an issue of pilots that I assume are also being stretched pretty thin with these nonstop flights. Obviously, we're in a ceasefire now, and they've been moved to Lebanon. But yes, I think this is an issue that you're hearing from internally for the time being. I don't think it's preventing Israel from carrying out operations in any of these fronts, but the argument is that it's just not sustainable in the long term.
I'll just say, again, I agree completely with everything that Jacob said. And I'll just say two other things. First, the problem that we have is the fact that we are not able, what we call, to close fronts, meaning that when you have these operational achievements like in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, whatever, then you don't have the diplomatic muscle in Israel to close it. Actually, we're looking at the decision-making process in Israel, decisions are being made without a process. And that is actually what it's creating, actually, is the fact that we still have the chances of deteriorating in Gaza, so you need soldiers there. Same, of course, goes in Lebanon, that we really stress in terms of what's happening over there. We don't have the Lebanese aid that we had during the war in Lebanon before the withdrawal from Lebanon. And of course, in terms of Syria, we're still there. Yes, in everything related to Iran, it's not, of course, troops on the ground, but even without Iran, you have the problems that with the West Bank and what's happening there as well. So this is one element of the problem that we have to relate. We have open fronts, never-ending war, and this is eroding the troops. It goes without saying. The problem that we have is politically we are not able to reach an agreement that actually recruit the Haredim into the IDF itself. So you have a lack of personnel, and adding to that, you have a mountain of missions that you have to achieve. Now, I don't think that the IDF will collapse in a way, but I think that it will be very hard to give answers to everything, all the problems that we have. And this is something that we have to relate to. And politically, I think there is another problem because I don't think there'll be a change because of we're getting close to the election, and I'm very skeptical of what will happen politically in Israel that will help the army. I think that it's actually only going to hurt the army, everything that's happening on political, domestic political developments in Israel. So when you sum it all up, you have multiple missions, and the number of soldiers stay the same, and even used to have 3 years compulsory service. Now we have 2 years and 8 months, and the army wants to extend that, but we cannot do that politically because there is the issue of the Haredim. So all in all, I don't think it will collapse, but it's eroding the soldier, it's eroding the commanders, and it's eventually leading us to problems in terms of our ability to sustain prolonged wars like we're sustaining right now. And I'll finish by that. There is a reason why David Ben-Gurion, when he drafted the first, maybe the only strategy of military strategy in Israel, preferred short wars. Because long wars create a lot of problems, burden on the society, burden on the economy. And I think the fact that we are, and this is the basic problem that we are facing, we are from October 7th, we are never-ending war, almost 1,000 days. And this is something that is actually, with the number of people that we have, the soldiers, is actually not, there's no correlation. So you are, it's not only that the reserve, but also the regular service. So in that aspect, I'm very skeptical for the future because I don't see any political change that will help the army, once. And second, I'll see only extension in terms of its mission, whether it's Lebanon, whether now it's West Bank and things like that. So we have major problems in terms of the army and its ability to follow the missions. Again, it's not going to be a collapse, but I think that definitely there are missions that we'll have to forego given the lack of personnel today in the army.
Thank you. Jacob, as you mentioned at the top, there were talks earlier today in Washington between the Lebanese and Israeli ambassadors to the U.S. to discuss the disarmament of Hezbollah. Iran insists the ceasefire includes Lebanon, but the U.S. and Israel say it does not. And Israel has continued strikes on Hezbollah since the agreement was announced, and same goes for Hezbollah. So what should our viewers know about the conflict in Lebanon since October 7th, including how it's affected life in the north and what we should expect to see in Lebanon after today's talks. And linking back to Iran, how sustainable is a ceasefire with Iran if it hinges on Israel refraining from taking action against Hezbollah?
All right, so on the first part of the question, I think there's a lot of anger right now amongst residents of the north who feel that their needs have been completely ignored, that they've been living under Hezbollah rocket fire and basically told to just cope with it, not given the tools to really rebuild their communities. The government the argument is that it's not really addressing their concerns. And what you're hearing from, at least from mayors, is that they just want a major military campaign in Lebanon that can ensure that their residents can remain safe. And I think they're the ones pushing for ideas like this buffer zone that the IDF has already basically created. The question of whether or not it remains there to enforce it. I think there's some interesting differences of opinion between the army, which says that it would rather basically create the zone and not really man it, but basically man it from above, versus the political echelon that would like actually to have troop presence there. And I think obviously in this climate, the political echelon typically wins the day. But again, that obviously can change as we get closer to an election. And then if there's a new government at the end of the year, there could be a recalculation. But the feeling is that, at least amongst those who are critical, and I think those who are also supporters of the government, or historically supporters of the government, they do want a more military-focused approach, that they just don't trust this an idea of trying to work with the Lebanese government that says the right things but isn't able to act. But the issue is that, as we've seen from these other fronts, the military-only approach hasn't really proven to be that successful in the case of Gaza, where you had not 2 years of fighting, and Hamas is only gaining power basically since the ceasefire, and has been able to prevent, I guess, any sort by rejecting proposals to disarm, is basically prevented the moving forward of this new government that's supposed to be being established there in Gaza. I think the dynamics are different in Lebanon, and I don't think it's fair to just simply say, okay, so therefore only military solution can't be effective in Lebanon. But again, it is something that they have tried. So I think there's simply a feeling amongst, I think, people in the north that we've tried both ways, and right now the way that will keep us more secure is the military approach, and that's, I think, what you're seeing from the government championing. I guess the question will be is if it can withstand pressure from the U.S., which I think now, following this agreement, is going to be looking to, or after this meeting today, I think we'll be looking to build on it by, again, calming the front in Lebanon. And that, I think you will see more. There was pushes for there to be a ceasefire in Lebanon even before Tuesday's meeting that didn't, that Israel withstood. And did limit some of its strikes, again, not going into deep into Beirut. But I think there's going to be additional calls from the U.S. I just texted with a U.S. official about the meeting today. There's no subsequent meeting held yet, but there's also no call specifically for, at least publicly, for a ceasefire. I think that is the approach in general of the Trump administration, is not to get into these more public disputes with Israel, like that were more characteristic with the Biden administration. But I do think that there is going to be a desire in Washington to build on the momentum that we had in today's meeting, and that will likely include scaling back the military operations, not intensifying them. And I think it'll probably depend on how the Iran agreement takes shape, because I think if Israel is seen as giving concessions on that front, maybe it'll have more leeway to act more aggressively against Hezbollah in Lebanon. But if the U.S. is concerned that aggression will lead to the collapse of the Iran agreement, then I think you're in another situation where actually it's going to be telling Israel to restrain itself on multiple fronts.
Yeah, I'll say, just to continue what Jacob said, we have to remember one thing about Iran and Lebanon is alike. There's no silver bullet solution for those problems. And we have to calibrate our expectations. as we cannot topple this regime from the air, the Iranian one, we cannot dismantle Hezbollah by using only kinetic means. It's not going to work unless Israel is keen to conquer all of Lebanon. Militarily, I don't think that we have much to do except what the Air Force is doing. On the ground operation, I think they're almost halted after Beach Bell and taking over Beach Bell. So I think in that regard, it really depends, like Jacob said, about happening in the negotiation between Iran and the US. I think that the US, despite the fact that they want to disconnect between both fronts in general, I think that if they will assume that that will lead to some sort of improved way to reach agreement with Iran, I think they will force their hands over Israel, especially now that you have negotiations started to reach some sort of a ceasefire. So I think ceasefire is possible. From the Iranian standpoint, definitely they want to see a ceasefire Lebanon, but ceasefire that they created and imposed, they don't want to see a negotiation, of course, between Israel and the state of Lebanon. And they're keen to preserve Hezbollah, like they want to preserve the other elements of the Axis, the Shia militias in Iraq, the Houthis, Hamas in Gaza, and of course, everything related to Hezbollah itself. So I think that there is a connection, of course, between both fronts. We have to pay a closer look to that. But I think the bottom line is that we have to assume that developments on the Iranian front will have an influence on the Lebanese one. And I think that in the end of the day, if the administration will understand that in order to improve the chances, which agreement you need to impose some sort of a ceasefire based on the meeting today, I don't think that President Trump would hesitate to do so, despite the grievances that Israel will have. In general, we have to remember that Israel and the U.S. is working together simultaneously, and of course the military cooperation is very good. But in terms of the political route, they are not aligned right now. They used to be aligned, but now the U.S. is trying to reach an agreement with Iran that Israel, of course, is opposed. Not that Israel has an ability to do something against it. I'm sure that behind the scene, Israel is trying to prevent an agreement, working with the U.S. administration, explaining that the Iranians are not meaning business and things like that, like happened in the past. But I think that in the end of the day, it's the U.S. and Washington call. And if President Trump will decide to reach an agreement, he will reach an agreement, and he will make the utmost to make sure that this agreement will work. So this is where we stand right now in the connection between both fronts.
One last thing I'll add is that there's this pretty incredible reporting that, speaking with a couple of U.S. officials, I was able to confirm it in the New York Times last week about how Netanyahu was able to convince President Trump with this Situation Room meeting in February. It just shows the extent of influence that the Israeli government has over President Trump's thinking, and actually how Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump are actually very quite aligned. That it wasn't necessarily about dragging, because President Trump really kind of saw eye to eye with Prime Minister Netanyahu on a lot of these issues, even if the other advisors were not convinced by a lot of the things that Netanyahu was trying to sell, even though most of the things Netanyahu did try to sell didn't end up actually coming true on I think all four goals that he talked about in this meeting in February. However, I think, so there is this assumption that Israel is controlling the U.S. I think that's a little bit overplayed, but can't be denied completely the extent of access that Prime Minister Netanyahu is given. But what we also have to take into account is the extent to which that Israel is reliant on the U.S. And I think where other countries around the world have tried to avoid their dependency on the U.S., given the unpredictability of Trump. Yes, there are some in the Gulf that have doubled down, but they've also diversified their alliances with other countries. Israel is one of the few countries that's just gone all in on President Trump. And that means their ability to actually say no when he decides to end the Iran war, for example, when it was actually before the Prime Minister Netanyahu said he was prepared to do, he wasn't really in a position to push back, or at least effectively do so. And the war ended when President Trump wanted. And I think that will be a relevant dynamic in future decisions regarding Lebanon as well. That yes, at the time the U.S. felt it was appropriate to continue allowing Israel to strike in Lebanon. That they do agree that strategically trying to separate those two fronts is in their benefit. But once they reach the point that, as Danny was talking about, where they feel that it risks the Iran deal, or the potential for an Iran deal, I think you will see them come down hard. And I don't think that Israel, given the amount that it's relying on the U.S., this isn't the Biden administration where you get political capital for basically saying no to the president. Here, you put a lot on the line, and Israel doesn't really have a lot of backup because they burned so many bridges with a lot of other allies across the world.
Thank you. Looking ahead in Iran and the regime there, Danny, is there any realistic scenario in which a more pragmatic faction reasserts itself, as it seems the IRGC is calling the shots currently? And do you see the Iranian regime collapsing at some point in the future, given the fundamental concerns in the country, especially economically?
Well, I'm not the bearer of good news. Again, I have to say something about the regime change. We don't have a crystal ball, and regime change, can come out. We are surprised when people went to the streets in January. So we have to be very cautious in our assessment regarding the strength of the regime. Having said that, I think that there is no viable opposition today in Iran. I think that what we created in our war is actually more extreme regime. It's not that I think that Ali Khamenei was a saint. He wasn't. But I think he was a balancer of the system between the IRGC and the more pragmatic guys. So what we have now is more or less the militarized version of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this is actually causing them to the more extreme behavior that they have. Now, I'm not saying that we cannot reach agreement with them. I think it's going to be hard, but I think that they have some flexibility they can show on the nuclear side, especially. But I think in general terms, what we got a worse version of the Islamic Republic. And that leads to the question of whether people go to the streets. Yes, we have to say that if this war will end with no easing of sanctions, then, and of course, when Iran cannot have the money coming from the toll booth on Hormuz Straits, then the economic situation would be very bad. They also suffered, it was bad before the war, and it's worse after the war. They suffered, I think, around $300 billion in damages, and this is, I think, only until now. So, and adding to what they had before, so definitely the economic situation would be very bad in Iran. But, and this is a big but, I think that the supporters of this regime, around 15 or 20 millions, are more cemented, because for them it's a divine win. They won, Israel and the US combined. This is what they have in mind. So I think for the foreseeable future, I don't think we'll see people going onto the streets. And if they go to the street, they'll be slaughtered the same way they're slaughtered in January 89, and even worse than that. For the longer period of time, then everything is possible, especially when the economic situation will be bad. But I wouldn't underestimate the will of the regime and the cohesion to preserve its strength. So the bottom line of that, I say that we are not in a way for regime change. Unfortunately, it was a regime with change with the regime, as mentioned, becoming more radicalized, more decentralized, more hard to work with. The pragmatics that were, they had some voice in the decision-making process, are weakened even more than they have today. The IRGC is controlling the shots. I don't see any moderate leader in the future. And I have to say one thing about that unfortunately, the way the Khamenei was decapitated actually led to the appointment of his son. I think in other scenario, when Khamenei would have died in natural causes, I don't think that his son would have been elected. I think he was elected just to create a continuous way of thinking of Khamenei, and to eventually to show President Trump that he cannot influence any decision-making process in Iran itself, because he was against Mujtaba from the beginning, from the outset. So this is actually our own doing. Again, it's not that Iran was moderate before, but I think it's really, we created a much worse version of Iran. And I think it's actually showed in their behavior during the war that they're not going to capitulate. And for the longer period of time, they will have problems because of the economic situation in Iran. But I think that for them, for the foreseeable future, given their achievements in the war, I think they're able to overcome that. What will happen within a year, 2 years' time, nobody knows, nobody can tell.
Thank you. For our last question, just quickly, let me ask each of you, what's the most likely scenario in the region over the next 3 to 6 months? If we can look out that far, Danny, or I'll take 3 to 6 weeks even. And what's the key indicator you'll be watching that tells you whether we're heading toward diplomacy or renewed conflict?
Me or Jacob?
Both.
Okay, so I'll start quickly, and then maybe I should have given Jacob to answer that first, but I will try my best. Look, it's all depending on, for this war is an historical war in so many ways. It's actually a game changer in the Middle East. So everything that we knew before, I'm not going to say it's 180 degrees change, but definitely we'll see changes in the Gulf states, and in Israel, and the relations with the US, and the Chinese and Russian involvement in the region, and of course the Iranian behavior. All those things actually, we have just regarding Iran. You have a new Iran after a supreme leader from '89 that is gone. So it definitely will be a new Iran, as mentioned, the control of the Al Jazeera, things like that. So it's first we have to assume that things will be different. Second, of course, it all comes down to the question of escalation or de-escalation and agreement. Because escalation will be very violent. The war will continue from where it stopped, and I think that we'll see even more dramatic effect on the energy sectors. I don't think it will topple this regime, but I think Iran will become a failed state. But it will cause major damage to its neighboring countries. And I think the Saudis and the Qataris are really fully aware of that and seek for a ceasefire. And if not, and if there's going to be an agreement, that will be also a game changer in terms of the strength of this regime. This regime will be able to overcome its problems, at least for the immediate term. And I think that it will have also influence on Israel and also the Gulf states in terms of need to, especially from the Gulf states, need to think about their policy regarding Iran. And I'm not ruling out that countries like Qatar and Oman actually will reach hands to Tehran, despite everything that happened, because of the fact that they understand that they have to hug the bear in order to prevent him from doing something else. And I think that actually Iran will be emboldened by this end. So we are in a very pivotal moment. Whatever we decide in the war will have a tremendous effect, not only in the Middle East, but also on the region, the international economy. And this is what we need to look at. Agreement, major change, strengthen the regime, and a lot of changes in the GCC and the Israel regarding Iran and the region. Escalation, then it's mayhem from the beginning, and we know how we're going to start. Nobody knows how it's going to end.
Yeah, I think one way to not have a good idea of where things are going is to listen to President Trump. That's not necessarily a criticism, but it's more that if you look at the public comments, he's really all over the place. Even today, he holds a call with a reporter and says their talks will not be in Islamabad if we hold the next round. And an hour later, he calls the reporter back and says, actually, they will be. I just remember my conversation with him a month ago, where he said that the decision to end the war would be a mutual one between him and Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think even at the time, I think it was hard to believe that would be actually the case, that Trump was going to be calling up Bibi and asking, is now a good time to end the war? I think that this is clearly Trump's decision at the end of the day. So I think the argument that his supporters will say in defense of it is that it keeps people on their toes. It keeps Iran guessing and not really knowing what its next step is going to be. But again, it's not a good indicator of where things necessarily are heading. And so I think a lot of what he says needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But I do think, based off of what I'm hearing, that de-escalation is right now the more likely scenario, that they do prefer it. And I think, as Danny was suggesting, that there will likely be another round of talks soon. President Trump is saying it as well, for whatever that means. But it's I think, given that, as Danny started out with by saying that both sides feel that they won, I think it's going to be quite difficult to reach a deal, even if there is another round of talks. Whereas I think you could well see maybe Oman, for sure Oman, but Qatar reaching out to Iran after this is over, recognizing that these are neighbors, they're here to stay. There's nothing else you can really do but work with them. That was kind of the approach from the entire Gulf before the war. That trying to isolate Iran diplomatically was not an effective strategy. That you need to work with them. You saw this normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran that was brokered by China several years ago. I think that was the approach then. And while Qatar, I think, is a question mark, I actually don't know for sure, based off of my own discussions with Qatari officials, that they will simply return to not business as usual, but resumption of engagement with Iran. I think countries like the UAE, Bahrain, and even maybe Kuwait and Saudi Arabia is another question as well, but also I think more in that camp than the other, are really not interested right now in dealing with this within a regime that they feel has not really changed. So I think there will be a real period of disconnect before maybe they come back and recognize that everyone's here to stay. We got to work together. But I think there is some real frustration. It was interesting seeing throughout the war, speaking to Emirati, Bahraini officials and others in the region, who almost sounded more hawkish than Israel in terms of the need to finish the job and go until regime is toppled. It was quite remarkable to hear. But that's really due to the frustration of coming under massive bombardment from Iran for these weeks and feeling that something's got to give, that we can't just go back to how things were.
Well, so much more to discuss. I have a million more questions I'd like to ask, but I'd like to now turn it over to DMFI President and CEO Brian Romick for closing remarks. And thanks so much to Danny and Jacob for participating. We hope to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. I also want to thank Jacob and Danny for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time and your perspective and expert analysis. With everything going on in Israel, Lebanon, Iran, and the region, there's no shortage of things to talk about, and we're going to continue to have webinars and keep people informed. And DMFI will continue to engage aggressively, strategically, and effectively with policymakers trying to strengthen the pro-Israel position in the Democratic Party. In fact, just last week, Joel Wenger, our chief political officer, and I were in New Orleans for the DNC meeting to make sure that anti-Israel resolutions once again did not pass the resolutions committee. With your support, we'll continue to stay engaged at the DNC and its task force to keep these harmful resolutions from passing. We'll encourage our party to keep their focus on where it belongs, staying united to win in November. Obviously, along with the board and the staff, as we seek to grow DMFI to meet these critical challenges, we need help. DMFI is entirely supported by generous individual donors. Your gift to DMFI will help us meet this moment and meet these challenges. You can scan the QR code on the screen or go to dmfi.org to make a gift. Thank you in advance, and I hope to see you again on the next webinar.